Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Replacing Peaker Power Plants with Clean Energy, a Frontline Vision for New York City. This webinar is a presentation of the Peak Coalition, and you can see the logos of the Peak Coalition members on your screen. Before I pass it over to our attendees for today's webinar, for our presenters for today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode. You can listen to the webinar using a couple of audio options. You can call in via telephone, or you can use your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there. You can also click on that to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit questions or comments. You can do that throughout the webinar, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. So again, please submit those questions and comments when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a webinar recording and a copy of the slides probably this afternoon, by tomorrow at the latest. We'll also post those on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to the moderator for today's webinar, Seth Mullendore. Seth is a project director and vice president here at Clean Energy Group, and he will be starting things off. Seth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. Looks like we have a good crowd already, and folks are still coming in. So we expect there to be a lot of Q&A. So just a reminder, as you think of questions, please do enter them in. So as Sam said, this is a presentation of the Peak Coalition. The Peak Coalition is made up of New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, UPROSE, the Point CDC, Clean Energy Group, and New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. You'll see a copy of the cover of our latest report, the Fossil Fuel Endgame here, which is available on our website, as well as the Peak Coalition website, which is peakcoalition.org. So we'll tell you more about Peak Coalition and the report coming up from our presenters today. So with that, I would like to introduce our great lineup of presenters, panelists. So first up, we're going to have Carlos Garcia. He is the energy planner for the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, NEJA. His work supports identifying high-impact renewable energy investment opportunities in low to moderate income communities, supporting energy transitions that lead to a low-carbon pathway, and working on frameworks to determine the developmental and economic benefits associated with reducing climate pollution. He previously worked at environmental law firms, the Peace Corps, the Peruvian government, Harvard University, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and as a University of Pennsylvania Energy Policy Fellow. Carlos has earned a BA in Environmental Studies from Goucher College and a Master's in Environmental Policy and Certificate of Law from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Then we're going to have a presentation from Strategen, who are our technical consultants for the report. First up, we're going to have Erin, who is a senior manager in the Strategen consulting practice, where she focuses on serving industry and utility clients on a range of issues relating to grid planning and decarbonization, emerging technologies and new business models, and retail and market incentive mechanisms. Prior to Strategen, Erin worked at Southern California Edison, where she held a variety of roles in strategy planning, regulatory, and procurement. Erin was a thought leader for Southern California Edison's economy-wide decarbonization strategy, where she supported groundbreaking clean energy and distributed resource procurement and led utility of the future implementation. Erin holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics and environmental economics from Pomona College. Then from Strategen, we're going to have Eliasid Animas, who is a senior analyst at Strategen, where he works on policy and business strategy for companies, utilities, and governments looking for clean energy solutions. Eliasid joined the Strategen team in 2017 as a Fulbright Fellow and has since participated in diverse projects across the U.S. and the world. He has gained expertise on electric power markets, resource adequacy, distributed energy resources, and electric vehicle integration. Before joining Strategen, Eliasid worked as a consultant across the development sector, focusing on city planning, energy efficiency, and transportation projects from the policy, business, and design perspective. He has a BA in urban and regional planning from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and training in business administration from UC Berkeley as a Fulbright grantee. Finally, joining us for the Q&A section is Dariella Rodriguez, who is Director of Community Development at the Point CDC. Dariella oversees community partnerships, advocacy, and environmental and climate justice efforts, including the implementation of the Point's community-based climate resiliency plan, the South Bronx Community Resilience Agenda, and as a Bronx resident who lives with her two sons, Dariella brings an abundance of passion for political education and mobilizing youth leaders. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Carlos Garcia to kick off the presentation. Carlos?
Thanks so much, Seth, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to talk to you guys more about the work that we're doing in and around peakers in New York City, but also just around the energy transformation sphere that New York is really going through right now. So thanks so much. So I'd like to give you an introduction into what the Peak campaign is and who it consists of first. As Seth mentioned, our coalition consists of UPROS and the Point CDC, which are community-based organizations here in New York City, which are members of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, where I work. We also have the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest that are also cited in New York City, and Clean Energy Group. And we've all come together to end, as it says, this long-standing issue of pollution burdens from peaker plants in New York City's most vulnerable communities and its environmental justice communities. So the reason why we have such an eclectic group is to bring together technical, legal, public health, and planning expertise to support organizing and advocacy led by the communities that are most harmed by peaker plant emissions. We also have a lot of other technical allies that are supporting this project, like Strategen. And together we're, with communities, we're advocating for a system of localized renewable energy generation and battery storage systems to replace these peaker plants, which will dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce co-pollutants, all while lowering energy bills and making our electricity system cleaner and more resilient in the face of increased climate impacts. And so the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking about the projects that we have and how these projects fit into our goals. And you're going to get a better sense of how all of our organizations work together to develop some of these projects and to see them come to fruition. Next slide, please. Great. So in talking about some of the projects and collaborations we've developed in our first year, and I can't believe it's almost to the day, it's been 1 year since the Peak campaign has publicly come out and established itself. I would love to highlight two projects. The first one being our Sunset Park Community Energy Study collaboration with NYC, and the other one is our groundbreaking agreement with the New York City Power Authority, New York Power Authority. And so talking about the NYC partnership, as you can see here, here's a nice little screenshot from one of the reports that we created. The studies of the Bay Ridge Load Pocket area, which is an area encompassing Bay Ridge, Gowanus, and Sunset Park, which our member UPROS is cited in, to better understand energy load demand profiles. And so this study is going to explore how clean energy alternative strategies can reduce run times at the privately owned Gowanus and Narrow peaker plant facilities, both, of course, located in the Bay Ridge Load Pocket area, and both of which are currently seeking a repowering. And so the project's resulting urban scale model represents an aggregate load of the building scale typology energy model. So, what does that mean? That means essentially that we're looking at the area around the peaker plant, in this case, 2 of them, and we're understanding who are all the demanders of energy, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, whether it's industrial. And once we understand that energy load profile, we're going to be able to better target energy efficiency, demand response, and just energy demand side management strategies to reduce the energy load demand around that peaker plant. And by doing that, we're going to more readily and easily replace those peaker plants with renewables and energy storage. So instead of having to replace, another way of thinking this, instead of having to replace a peaker plant one for one with energy storage and renewable energy, we're going to make the area around it more efficient so that that peaker isn't needed as much, or at least that much amount of energy isn't needed. And then after we've done that, we're going to replace it with renewables and energy storage. And of course, on top of replacing the peaker plant, we're also going to be saving tenants in and around that area massive amounts of energy and bill savings each month, as well as creating resiliency hubs and helping them face extreme weather events in the future. Next slide. Great, and the final partnership that I can share with you all today is a really exciting partnership, which according to our research is the first in the United States between a state public power utility and community and environmental justice-based organizations. And that is to take the beginning steps of implementing renewable and battery storage replacement or augmentation of that state public power utility's existing fleets. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with New York's energy authorities, the New York Power Authority, also known as NYPA, is a New York State public benefit corporation, and it is the largest state public power utility in the United States. And so we're currently in the process right now. And as it says, the MOU that we have signed was to engage in a study with 2 technical consultants to execute and assess all 6 peakers in the United States and 1 in Long Island that NYPA owns, and look at, through a very extensive modeling, what it looks like to replace economically and physically these peakers with renewables and energy storage. And so all the way from the policy sphere, all the way down to the actual project development and project assessments of peakers and replacing them, the Peak Coalition has made some amazing strides in its first year, and 2021 looks poised to be another amazing year with even higher goals. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Carlos. So with that, we'll turn things over to Erin from Strategen.
Thanks so much, Seth. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Childs. I'm a senior manager at Strategen Consulting, and today my colleague Eliasid and I will be talking about our collaboration with the Peak Coalition. This collaboration was focused on creating a roadmap for the replacement of peaker plants with clean energy resources to benefit the communities of New York City.
Yeah, and hi, my name is Eliasid Animas. I'm a senior analyst at Strategen. And to provide you with a brief background, Strategen Consulting is a globally connected and impact-driven firm on a mission to decarbonize energy systems. Here, Erin and I focus on topics related to grid decarbonization, emerging technologies, and sustainable business models, which means that we get to work on some of the thorny and more structural issues that have the ability to really hamper or accelerate the transition.
Thanks so much, Eliasid. In keeping with that focus, we've been working with the New York City community and environmental justice groups for about 2 years to develop a plan for how to advance clean community energy solutions in New York City. From our perspective, that work has had 3 main objectives. The first has really been crystallizing the costs that go along with the existing fossil energy systems. The second has been thinking about some of the technically feasible solutions that can help to reduce New York's dependence on fossil fuel infrastructure. Finally, we've been building alignment on that future state vision and working on a collaborative path forward. Today, we'll be talking about the challenges presented by peakers for local communities, and that really means both costs as well as environmental damages and the impacts that those have on communities. We'll also be spending some time thinking about the solutions that can be brought to bear against those challenges and how those solutions can help us to retire all New York City peakers by 2030. We'll also be spending some time talking about what's needed to make this vision a reality, what's still ahead for some of the community leadership, for some of the clean energy legislation in New York, some of the policy actions that are needed to advance this vision, and how we might see those lessons and applications showing up for other cities. So, the first thing that we had to do in this process was really to sharpen our understanding of why we still have peakers in urban areas and what role they play on the electrical system in this context. There's really three main reasons why peakers are currently such an important part of urban grid operations today. First, peakers have the ability to respond quickly to demand spikes in a way that other resources generally can't match. Second, peakers are relatively compact assets, so they're easier to site inside of urban areas. This is important for providing in-area generation, which helps with both electrical stability and managing transmission constraints. Finally, peakers can provide a variety of reliability services that help to keep the lights on. The problem with this, of course, is that peakers tend to be disproportionately located in low-income communities of color. This map shows where peakers are located in New York City and how that compares to some of the most vulnerable populations in the city. These peakers are not only a significant source of greenhouse gases, they also produce local pollutants like NOx, SOx, and criteria pollutants that have some significant health impacts. NOx and SOx are known to cause damage near their emission sources and increase incidences of respiratory disease, cancer, and premature mortality.
And for your awareness, this map also highlights the census districts where the majority of the population is either low income or part of an ethnic minority. This means that those darker yellow areas in the map are neighborhoods where 60% or more of the residents are people of color or low income. And we define low income here as, like 2 times the federal poverty line. As you can see in the map, peakers vary in size and color depending on their capacity and utilization. Since many of the emissions that come from those peakers are local pollutants, the map also shows areas contained within a 1 mile and a 3 mile radius of those peakers. So this can help you think about the neighborhoods that are most affected by those peakers and their emissions. Out of the almost 8 million people living in New York City, about 750,000 people are living within 1 mile from a peaker plant, and almost 80% of them are either low-income people or people of color. As you know, let's go to the next slide. Peakers emit both local and global pollutants. So for context, local pollutants are the ones causing damage near their emission source. And these, as Erin said, include sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides. Both are precursors of PM 2.5. And, these peakers, as compared to other power plants in the city, emit these pollutants at a really disproportionate rate, causing, again, respiratory illness, cancer, premature mortality. And as we saw in the map, peakers are also disproportionately located close to those communities of color and low income. In monetary terms, the New York City peakers, just the fleet that we identified, cost the state an estimated $43 million annually based on increased morbidity and mortality. And these numbers is expected to increase to about 50 million by 2030. On the other hand, the global pollutants refer to greenhouse gas emissions, most importantly carbon dioxide. CO2 concentrates in the atmosphere causing climate change worldwide, regardless of the source of the emissions. And these cause impacts related to things like changes in agricultural productivity, property damages from, for example, floods, human health impacts, energy system cost, and like some other aspects of the economy that are accounted for in the value of carbon. So considering this value of carbon, the CO2 emissions of New York City, just from the peaker fleet again, cost the world about $330 million annually. And these are also set to increase to about 380 million annually by 2030. So overall, considering both kind of pollutants, what we are proposing as a retirement roadmap for peakers could avoid emissions and bring a net present value of about $1.2 billion just by 2035.
Thanks so much, Eliasid. So for this particular collaboration with Peak, we wanted to focus on the opportunity to retire the oldest and least used plants in New York City. These older plants tend to be some of the most polluting. As you can see, some of these plants have been hanging on for the better part of a century. For context, the average life of a fossil asset is about 50 years old, so a lot of these are really past their expiration date. In part because of their age and inefficiency, these plants are often used very infrequently. This makes it much easier to replace the energy and other grid services that these power plants provide. The power plants that we looked at, which are highlighted in blue here, all ran less than 15% of the year in 2018. And 60 out of the 89 units in the fleet ran less than 1% of the time. That's more than 2/3 of these units. Yet customers are still paying to ensure that these plants are available during times of peak demand, which is extremely inefficient. As we look across this portfolio, we're considering about 6 gigawatts of peakers that are prime candidates for retirement and replacement due to their age and usage levels. So this is where clean new resources come in. We focused on 4 different types of resource solutions that have already been called out in state law, specifically the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The first of those is offshore wind. Offshore wind will be a key element as it's one of the most readily available bulk power resources able to interconnect into the city. The state is already planning for the development of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind over the next decade and a half. Rooftop solar is also another great renewable resource that can be located on homes and businesses to produce energy within the city. Energy efficiency will be able to significantly reduce demand, and most importantly, helps to reduce demand during some of the peak hours by reducing power needs from appliances like air conditioners. Finally, storage is the resource that helps to integrate all of them, ensuring that we have the right amount of power when we need it. We'll be talking about each of these resources in turn and how they play a role in clean energy solutions for New York City. So let's start with storage, as it's been getting some of the biggest attention as a solution to replace fossil power. Storage is a must-have to replace the reliability services that peakers currently provide. Storage is well positioned to address some of the key challenges that we talked about before in terms of ramping capabilities, physical footprint, and faster reliability services. Storage is absolutely critical for resource integration, grid balancing, and flexibility. But it has to charge from somewhere, and that's where our other clean resources come in. New York State has established a goal to develop 9 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2035. Given the areas that have opened up for offshore wind development, we're expecting that most of these resources will be off the shore of New York, and that most of these resources will end up interconnecting directly into New York City and Long Island. Procurements already completed have signed up roughly 4 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, so the state is very much on track to meet its offshore wind goals in a timely fashion. As we've seen these wind projects being developed, we've also seen that offshore wind has been a great mechanism to invest in the ports and the communities that host them, as well as to grow the local economy and local jobs. Another key part of the mix is rooftop solar. The rooftop solar developments that we're showing here have been supported through the NY Sun program. NY Sun is a major component of the New York REV, or Reforming the Energy Vision, which aims to create a cleaner, more resilient, and affordable energy system for all New Yorkers. It provides incentives, financing, education services for customers, and also provides access to community solar programs. Now, New York State as a whole has made great progress in rooftop solar deployment. In fact, it's on track to meet its goal of 6 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2025. The NYSERDA-run solar incentive program has seen as much as 800 megawatts a year deployed in 2019, a significant growth even from the beginning of the last decade, where installations were closer to 30 megawatts a year. However, not all parts of the state have benefited equally from this boom in solar development. Only 6% of all rooftop solar has been installed in New York City. Yet, New York City is home to roughly a third of the population of the state, which means that all of those people have been paying to support this program, but haven't been able to reap the benefits. A big part of achieving the peaker retirements that we've laid out here is growing the rooftop solar installations in the city to be more right-sized with the opportunity and the need for clean resources. A study by NREL has estimated that New York City has the technical potential for as much as 8 gigawatts of distributed solar. This means that the rooftops have the ability to fit 8 gigawatts of solar panels. So we have a lot of room to grow relative to the rooftop solar that's currently in place today. Energy efficiency was also a big part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act laid out by the state. The state has targeted 185 trillion BTUs of end-use energy savings by 2030. NYSO has developed estimates of how they expect these targets to impact overall energy demand over the next decade. We actually use the lower end of these forecasts to make sure that we're using a conservative reliance on incremental energy efficiency deployments. Now, the real magic happens when these different resource types come together. What you're seeing here is one of the most challenging weather days in 2030. The dotted black line shows how peakers have historically dispatched during these times, while the green line represents how clean resources, including energy efficiency, offshore wind, and rooftop solar could be contributing to meeting energy needs. On these days in particular, offshore wind is really low, and we need storage to step up and ensure sufficient resource availability. The light blue areas on the chart represent the way that storage integrates with renewable energy to fill the same energy needs that peakers were meeting before. When we look at the characteristics of storage that will be needed, we're considering roughly 4.2 gigawatts of 8-hour storage by 2030. The great part about planning for both renewables and storage is that the renewables are able to help charge the storage without having to bring more power into the city. This helps to prevent transmission congestion and support local reliability. Most of the resources that we're describing here are already required as part of state law, but some additions will be incremental to the existing plan. This chart shows how we expect these resources to show up over time and also identifies where resources are incremental to existing state law. What we're showing in terms of state policy, existing state policy, is around 5,400 gigawatts of energy efficiency from the NYSO forecasts, 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, which translates to about 6 gigawatts by 2030, 6 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2025, and 3 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030. Now, when we think about the pieces that are incremental, we're also expecting to see a need for some incremental energy storage, around 1.2 gigawatts of 8-hour storage or equivalent by 2030. We're also looking at some continued deployment of rooftop solar even after the state meets its 2025 goals to add another 2 gigawatts by 2030. Now, let's come back to our real objectives here, which is figuring out how we can retire fossil assets. Over the next decade, these resources we've been talking about here will enable the retirement of over 6 gigawatts of fossil fuel resources. By 2025, we're expecting to be able to retire around 3,231 megawatts of fossil fuel capacity. This capacity will come most heavily from the really infrequently used plants, the ones that have very low annual capacity factors. The remaining 2,863 gigawatts of capacity can all be retired by 2030. As we think about the feasibility of this pathway, it's not just about resource development, it's also about the economics and cost effectiveness of these resources. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eliasid to walk us through some of the cost effectiveness analysis for storage particularly.
Thank you, Erin. Let's forget about the emission savings for a moment, and let's think about the market benefits of the roadmap. When we think about assessing the savings or value that could be realized specifically in the capacity, energy, and ancillary services markets. So let me stop here for context. The energy markets are how we ensure sufficient energy to power everyone's homes and businesses, while ancillary services are products that help to make sure that our power system is flexible enough so that we can meet demand when multiple people turn on their lights on or heat or AC, for example, at once. The capacity value, on the other hand, is what we are willing to pay resources to be available and ready when we need them. So you need to think of it as a way to reserve resources ahead of time. So those are the three main revenue streams of power plants in New York. So generally, we see that the capacity price is based on what our resource needs to recover its costs after selling in the energy and ancillary services markets. So capacity costs are a way to do an apples to apples comparison between energy storage and gas peakers in what it is a rather complex market. So let me explain what you're seeing in this chart. You are seeing the annualized net costs or expected capacity cost of adding new storage relative to the savings from stop paying gas peakers in the capacity market. So storage in blue, peakers in gray. So our proposed portfolio calls for both shorter duration storage, which is approximately 4-hour duration resources. Those are the light blue bars, and longer duration storage, closer to 8 hours in duration. Those are the darker blue bars. These two resources have different cost profiles. So that's why we are showing them separately. And the green area on top is showing the difference in cost between the status quo, the dotted black line, and the cost of the proposed roadmap, the green line. So that green area in between shows all of the potential benefits that we might be able to capture by substituting storage in the place of peaking resources. So this analysis shows a potential net present value of about 1 billion to be realized by 2035 in net present value. And I will note here that when we say potential, that means that we are looking at the low end of energy storage cost forecasts, which are realistic, but New York City will need to remove regulatory and market barriers to really realize those costs.
Thanks so much, Eliasid. The other thing that's really important to note when we're talking about the cost effectiveness of this roadmap is that we're actually proposing something that has benefits that aren't really well captured by existing energy markets. So what Eliasid talked us through is really specifically focused on those energy markets and how we value resources in the energy market. But those assessments and those tests often don't capture benefits like savings from reduced morbidity and mortality in the city, mitigation of future climate change impacts, increased resiliency for some of the climate or extreme weather events that Carlos mentioned, and the creation of high quality and green jobs. Some of these benefits, like health and mortality benefits and climate change costs, are already being captured by the state in the way that we estimate the cost of plant emissions and tie back to some of the emissions costs that Eliasid talked about at the beginning of this. Other benefits like resilience and job creation just really aren't well captured in traditional cost effectiveness tests. So we do need to take a step back and think holistically about how these systems come together and the overall benefits that we're creating for New York City. Now, when we turn to thinking about what it's going to make to take this happen, there are a couple of key pieces that can really help to move the needle. First, as we've mentioned, figuring out how to really accelerate rooftop solar development in New York City. Rooftop solar deployments in the city are currently planned at the state level, but we really need to see those deployments focus on the city specifically, as we've already talked about. To get to these levels of solar, we're looking at close to a 13x increase on the current levels of local installations. Realistically, this is not something that will happen organically. We're likely going to need to look at changes to existing rules, and we're also going to need some engagement from some of the key energy agencies in the state. I know that we've seen some great programs from NYPA helping to deploy solar on schools and public buildings, and we'd love to see programs like that continue to grow and expand. We're also going to need to figure out how to site energy storage in the city. Historically, energy storage has been hard to develop in New York City as compared to other cities in the country, in large part due to the difficulty of finding available land space. Market rules have also historically created barriers, but we know that NYSA is working to address those barriers. Something that you'll note from the storage cost effectiveness calculations that Eliasid walked us through is that storage will become increasingly cost effective in the latter half of this decade as storage costs continue to decline. We really need to resolve some of these challenges in time to let storage flourish in the city. Finally, although we are looking at more conservative energy efficiency forecasts from NYSO, even realizing these may require some investments or building retrofits. I do want to remind everyone that what we're laying out here is really only the beginning. The state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act has established a target of completely zero emission electric sector by 2040. The peakers that we've been talking about replacing in the analysis are represented on this chart by the blue bars, and they certainly represent a big step in the right direction. But to achieve state policy mandates, we're going to have to figure out how to get another 4.5 gigawatts of fossil fuel power plants out of the city. To achieve both the changes that we've laid out here and the ones that are around the corner for 2040, we see a couple of key policy actions that can be taken by grid operators, state policymakers, and local leaders. From grid operators, a big piece of the puzzle is ensuring that we evaluate resources based on the value that they provide to the grid. This helps with cost-effective and competitive deployment of resources, which helps keep costs down for electric customers. This means ensuring that storage and renewable resources get fairly compensated for the benefits that they're providing to the grid, especially their flexible capacity benefits. For distributed energy resources, this means thinking about the locational value that distributed resources can provide. A megawatt of rooftop solar in the city may be able to provide much more significant benefits to local reliability than a megawatt of rooftop solar in an area that's already had relatively high rooftop solar adoption. Finally, we also want to start sending signals to the market about the need for clean capacity resources. Many of the capacity resources in New York City today are fossil fueled. If the state is going to achieve its policy goals, we need to find a way to transition towards clean capacity resources in a structured fashion. From our state policymakers, we need continued commitment to support distributed resources. We need to continue to advance energy storage, energy efficiency, and other distributed or community resources. Where appropriate, we need to allow those resources to be compensated for their clean or renewable energy attributes. We've seen great partnerships from the state in helping to ensure offshore wind development, and we need to continue to lean into those partnerships to ensure that we're bringing offshore wind offline. Finally, given the challenges that we've seen with storage development in the city, state policymakers may want to think about the role of state agencies in helping to facilitate storage development. NYSERDA has really done wonders in accelerating the deployment of offshore wind, and we'd love to see similar advances for energy storage. Finally, we also want to acknowledge the role that local leaders will play in helping to turn this vision into reality. We need to have a thoughtful conversation about how we can find some space in urban areas to allow for clean energy development. And that's something that really needs to happen with city and community leaders. These same city leaders will be important to get the appropriate city agencies involved in facilitating key portions of resource development, including zoning, permitting, siting, and interconnection. City and community leaders will also be pivotal in supporting some of the more customer-focused policy goals, such as energy efficiency or rooftop solar. Last but not least, we do want to encourage continued collaboration with key stakeholders across the city as we think about how to address some of the challenges and opportunities that we've talked about today. As we close up here, I do want to note that these kinds of solutions are not a far distant future type of solution. This is something that's happening today. Storage is already being used as a solution that can replace urban peakers. In New York City, LS Power has been leading the charge with its Ravenswood plant. LS Power is planning to replace their existing peaker with a 316 megawatt 8-hour battery. In Southern California, SoCal Edison is moving forward with a portfolio of 4-hour batteries to replace the Puente power plant. And in the Bay Area, we're seeing East Bay Community Choice aggregators looking at a combination of central station and distributed batteries. This is another great point I'd like to highlight, which is that storage has great flexibility to be used as either a utility scale or distributed solution, both of which can help to address these kinds of challenges. The last point I'd like to leave with folks is that the challenges we're talking about here are not unique to New York. As states and communities push to retire their fossil assets in line with state and local climate goals, the need for clean energy solutions in urban regions will continue to grow. What we've laid out here includes a lot of least regret actions that cities across the country could take to improve the quality of life for their residents. So with that, I will turn it back to Seth and open things up for Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for the presentations. I think this is the most active Q&A I've seen during the presentations for any of the webinars that I've hosted. So we've got a lot of questions already. We probably are not going to have time to get to them all. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I think we do have the ability to stay a few minutes over, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. For those that asked, the slides will be available, and this is being recorded, and the recording will be shared to everyone within the next probably day, so you will all have that. So first, just a general question about the definition of peaker plants versus baseload resources. This is probably to Erin. Can you just give people an idea for this study and kind of in general where the cutoff is for peakers versus baseload power plants?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. And that's a great question. The definition that we used for peakers here was less focused on some of the traditional definitions and more focused on how we see some of these fossil assets operating in the city and providing energy services. So our cutoff point was really looking at plants that had capacity factors of 15% or less on an annualized basis.
Great, and just so folks know, the capacity factor basically is the amount the plant runs, the number of hours it runs versus operating the whole time. So 15% would mean that 15% of the hours of the year that it runs or less. And many of these run only, a couple of hundred hours a year, so very small fraction. There was a question just about the value of the capacity payments that you talked about. One person raised that, what are the actual payments that are being paid to these plants? They mentioned that Dan Scammer, which is more of a baseload plant, not in New York City, was paid $21 million a year to stand by. Can you give a sense of how maybe that compares to New York City capacity payments relative to something in one of the other areas of New York?
Yeah, great question. So I will say that, we did look at the capacity market in New York City to establish, what expected capacity payments were. New York City, given its transmission constraints and kind of limited geographical space for energy assets, is much higher than other regions in the state or even around the country. So if I'm recalling correctly, we were looking at close to, during peak periods, close to $13 a kilowatt month, but I might ask Eliasid to check that and add any other color he thinks is helpful.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, we actually look at the capacity market for the last 10 years or so. So the capacity price, in the city changes by season. So you have like the winter season, or non-summer season, and the summer season, which is the high one. So for summer seasons, you have like prices in between the 13 to 15 dollars. And then like that's when you are actually using most of these speaker plants. Non-summer season, it's like somewhere about the eight to $4. So they vary, but in average, yeah, as you said, New York City has some of the highest capacity prices in the country.
And related to the capacity prices, this goes to the chart that you went through, Eliasid, talking about the economic benefits, looking at energy storage versus the peaker plants. There was a question about the cost of the peakers versus the storage and the benefit, asking whether or not the capacity payments would just be needed to go to the energy storage, so whether that would take up that revenue that's being applied to energy storage.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the thing with the price of capacity, right, is that it's set up based on the resources that are available or bidding in the market. So if you have mostly these speakers bidding into that market, then that will raise the cost of or the price of the clearing price of the capacity, because they need this large amount of money to actually recover their costs. Remember that they are like just sitting there, functioning like sometimes 1% of the time. That's 1% of the time when they are selling actual energy or services to the grid, and then all the rest they are recovering this through the market. So in the other hand, if you start like putting more storage resources, those will also ideally be bidding into the market, right? So yeah, the answer is yes, they will need capacity payments too, but what our analysis is trying to show is that those capacity payments are gonna be smaller than the ones needed for keep the peakers in place.
Great, thanks for that, Eliasid. So there was one that was more of a comment, just talking about in the chart showing the 1 mile and 3 mile radius around peaker plants, that emissions don't follow nice circles, that they're going to follow the patterns that they follow based on geography and weather patterns. But it would be great, Dariella, if you could chime in. Just, we haven't really heard the community perspective on emissions and how these peakers are really impacting community. So it would be great if you could speak on that perspective a little bit.
Thank you, Seth. So I think for us, it's really critical to understand that there are not many big opportunities to take like bold, brave, creative action that gets to like systemic problems, and that this is one of those times where we take all the different kinds of work that we do, where we do community research, where we partner up with the experts, where we have citywide partnerships to get to the root causes and to really address systemic problems with big systemic solutions. And so for us in EJ communities, we really do want to uplift and have spaces like this to bring not only like a combination of community-led solutions, but data research that confirms our experiences and that uplifts solutions that are doable, that does the work of folks that might be able to say like it's too hard to have these kind of solutions, like it's mapped out here. And so for us, we use these reports and others to really support the work that we are doing on the ground, support the experiences of communities that are impacted in ways that are like, we have whole programs to address heat in our community, and that's because we know that the most vulnerable folks in our community are vulnerable to death because of heat, and death because of air quality issues. And that for us in EJ communities, these solutions are the way for us to not only survive in our communities, but be able to stay in our communities and thrive in them. And so I guess from our lens, that's what we see this report being, again, research and data that supports the work that we are doing on the ground, and we need more of it. And the fact that there's already a map and a plan just helps us fight for that need in our community.
Thank you, Dariella. A question came in about the closure of India Point nuclear power plant and how that will impact the ability to retire gas-fired generation. I don't know, Carlos, I know you've recently commented on this. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, great, thanks, Seth. So again, I think and unfortunately, the use of these peaker plants really depends on a season-to-season basis. So even going down to what day the hottest days of the year fall on, whether it's a weekend or a weekday, can make all the difference in terms of how these peakers are responding and for how long they're responding for. Right, so to add some color to that, if the hottest day of the year happens to be on a weekday, and we'll just use the example, I guess now or pre-COVID, when everybody was at the office and in these kind of really inefficient, massive buildings downtown in New York City, the amount of energy that's being demanded is sky high, versus if it was on the weekend, where people are more likely to be more at home and not be in the workplace and really just be at kind of one place at one time. Where historically in New York, the houses are more efficient than the commercial spaces, the energy demand is going to be lower, still high, but lower. And so those peaker plants aren't going to be needed as much. So to the degree that Indian Point has on the actual runtime and the actual projections for peaker plants to be used or called upon more, that's really to be seen, and that's not something that any one person could really calculate, given just not being able to calculate when the hottest day of the year is going to be this summer. But one of the things, like I said, that we are trying to do is decrease that energy demand with those community energy studies. The first one being at Sunset Park, the next one we hope to do with in tandem with the Point in Hunts Point in the Bronx, is to really decrease the energy demand around those peakers, so that it won't really matter in terms of how much energy is being taken offline more upstate, and more so about what the localized energy, distributed energy resources can create and how they can respond to that demand.
Great, thanks, Carlos. A question for Strategen, for Erin and Eliasid. Is demand response considered in the solutions to replace peaker plants in this analysis?
Yeah, I think demand response is definitely going to be an important part of the solution, especially as we talk about some of the peak days. Carlos was speaking specifically to some of the times where we see energy demand being highest, and that's right really what drives usage of peakers. For this particular analysis, we focused on existing state law and implementation of that state law. So, if we were to see the state be able to establish some pretty significant demand response programs, that could help to bring down some of the storage investment numbers, which really just helps to make this more cost effective for everyone.
Great. A question about electrification. As we move to more electrification of heating, technologies like heat pumps and transportation with electric vehicles, how was that factored into the analysis, and how will that impact future peaking needs? There was another question about winter peaking as we move to more electrification for heating, and how offshore wind might match up with some of those winter peaking events.
Yes, that is a great question and a pretty complicated one. So I guess a couple of points here. First, as we look at the next decade, going from 2020 to 2030, NYSO is currently forecasting for demand to stay relatively consistent. And I think that's a function of energy efficiency actually helping to offset some of the increased energy usage from transport and building electrification. Now, as we turn the corner into 2040, I think there is expectation that overall consumption will grow as a result of that electrification. But an important part about this is that especially if we think about transport electrification, there's a lot of flexibility there. Your car doesn't necessarily need to be charging right at 5 o'clock when you get home, presuming that we're all allowed to leave our homes again. But it can charge instead overnight or when wind production is highest. So there's a lot of ways that electrification is not only a challenge, but also can help to be a part of the solution set as we think about ways to retire peakers.
And Seth, if I could add a little color to that as well, just to piggyback a little bit of what Erin said, energy efficiency is something, right, that not only are we studying in the community energy study and really seeing how we can be more targeted in the replacement of peakers, but it's something that community groups have identified as a problem and is focused on from a policy perspective for years, right? NEJA and our members through our Climate Works for All coalition helped write and pass a law here in New York City called Local Law 97, which is the most ambitious and most targeted energy efficiency law in the United States, and some people say in the world, aimed at commercial building spaces 25,000 square feet and above, right? Those buildings that I said are the most inefficient, and that New York City, due to its building typology, has a very unique demand profile because of its commercial buildings. So I think, like as Erin said, it's a little bit tough, and it's always the kind of golden question of how energy demand is going to look in the future, given all these different things. But even outside of peak, community organizations like The Point, Uprose, NEJA, and like all of our allies have been focused on a lot of energy demand policies for reductions for years now, and this is no exception.
Great, thank you. So there is a question about the perspective of peaker plant owners, whether or not we see them adopting these resources, and what challenge could be in convincing them to accept distributed energy resources. I could start off with just saying that we've seen a mix so far from peaker plant owners. Two peaker plants in New York City are proposing repowering their power plants with gas. Again, Astoria gas turbine and Gowanus peaker plants. On the flip side, there's the Ravenswood plant that has peaking units that is proposing a large battery system to provide peaking power as an alternative. I do think that large resources like significant battery developments like at Ravenswood are going to be more favorable solutions for peaker plant owners, so that they can develop solutions within the footprint of their existing facilities, whereas distributed energy resources may be harder to get their buy-in, as they will less likely have control and ownership over those resources. But I'd love to hear from others, from Carlos or Erin and Eliasid, if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think something we see is that a lot of these large infrastructure owners have ability to deploy a wide array of assets, right? So Ravenswood is a great example of where we're seeing a company taking kind of a strategic pivot towards clean energy solutions. And I think that applies not just for storage, but we're also seeing opportunities for distributed solar deployment, et cetera. So We'd really like to see folks thinking about this as an opportunity to grow their business, opportunity to really be a part of the clean energy economy.
Great. I know we're at time. Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
No. Sorry. I agree with Erin. I think, right, with the passing of the CLCPA, with the new DEC NOx rules, the writing on the wall for natural gas or fossil fuel combustion generation is very apparent, right? Which is why you have so many proposals for repowering, why you have, as Erin mentioned, right, Ravenswood deciding to replace all of their peaker plants with energy storage systems, why you have all of this time and attention for the development and market design changes to better support and to better quantify the benefits that these clean energy resources actually bring. I think for us, and as we've seen with NYPA, right, Peak is open to working with whichever organization wants to make the right decision and make the right choice, the one that not only New York State policy has decided, but the one that through our policy, the New York City's communities and New York State's communities have decided. And so we welcome, as with NYPA, any opportunity to work with people and share our thoughts about how not only their technology can be cleaner and more responsive to the communities that they serve, but also take the community's ideas and community energy planning ideas into account for how they can be better integrated into our communities. And so like I said, we welcome it. We've seen it with a couple of owner operators, and we expect them all to eventually come to the same conclusion that we have, which is peaker plants are no longer viable, and the sooner that you replace them, the better it's going to be for your bottom line.
Great, thanks, Carlos. So I know now we're a little bit past time. I think there are a couple other questions I'd like to get to. So if folks can stay on, great. For folks that have had to drop off, hopefully they can listen to the recording. These will be included in there. The first is a question that says, in Nebraska, claims are being made that new gas peaker plants can be switched to clean hydrogen in the near future. Is this likely? This is something that we're seeing in New York City as well. The Astoria plant said that it will comply with New York State's net carbon zero law in 2040 by switching to hydrogen. So it is unlikely, and there are a lot of things to be factored into this as well with hydrogen combustion. Regardless of where the hydrogen is coming from, there are emissions, not carbon emissions, but there are still very high levels of NOx emissions that are problematic with hydrogen combustion, which is very concerning because that's still a local pollutant impacting the surrounding communities, higher in fact than natural gas NOx emissions. Also, you have to consider where the source of that hydrogen is. There's a lot of talk about green hydrogen, which is currently an extremely small market and takes a lot of renewable energy to produce. There's blue hydrogen, which comes from gas with carbon capture and storage, which says that it can capture the carbon. This is also a very small market today, and there are a lot of upstream emissions that still come along with getting the gas to those areas to produce the hydrogen. Most of it is what's called the gray hydrogen, which comes from directly from fossil fuels. So it's not very clean, the production of hydrogen today. So this is something that is also being battled in New York. Carlos, you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you said it pretty well. I think the distinction between hydrogen combustion and hydrogen fuel cells is one that we're particularly interested in. I think hydrogen as a combustion fuel source, as you said, is one that for a lot of the peaker power plant owners, that are seeing the writing on the wall, they're really trying to grasp at whatever kind of alternative, or as we call them, false solutions that they can to try to keep their assets and their bottom line, net present value positive, economic, right, bankable. I just think it's comical, right, and a little bit unusual, and I think they're kind of preying on people not knowing our policies or really the rules, but that these peaker plants are suggesting hydrogen combustion as a way of complying with the CLCPA, when we see that the combustion of hydrogen is sometimes 6 times higher emissions profiles of releasing NOx than regular peaker plants. Many of these peaker plants are actually decommissioning and having to repower because of the DEC NOx rules. And the combustion of nitrous oxide, of green hydrogen, the emission profiles of those nitrous oxides would make them not be able to run even now because of the DEC NOx rules. So again, when you really understand why these peaker plants or power plant owners are suggesting an alternative that even on its face is just illegal, they're really preying on, again, taking the naivety of a lot of people to just take them at their face value of what they're saying and trust them, and not really understanding that, once again, right, they're really trying to get this for their bottom line and really stay online and producing with the same amount of fuel or the same fuel source type or in the same generation profile type as they can, because it's just economical to them now. But again, we welcome anybody who's serious about their alternatives and cleaning up their emissions profile and their business platform.
Great. So we're pretty well over time at this point. I think we're going to close out the questions there. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Thank you for all of our presenters, panelists. Great Q&A, and I turn it back to Sam. I don't know if you have any announcements about future webinars that the Clean Energy Group has as well.
Thanks, Seth. So we do have webinars coming up. I don't have a slide for it, but if you visit cleanegroup.org/webinars, you'll see some information about the webinars that we have coming up in, we don't have any more in April, but we've got a bunch in May. So please do visit our website and check those out. That's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we'll hopefully see you all at an upcoming webinar. Bye, everyone.